Good morning. I want to start with a question. What happens to a country when an entire generation isn't learning? Not for a period of time, not during a pandemic, but for years. Raise your hand if you think that it is essential that all children are attending school for a country to thrive. Keep it raised if you think that this is not enough, but we also need to ensure that children have the conditions to actually learn in the classroom. Thank you. None of these things are happening in Venezuela today. So I want to talk about the learning crisis that has unfolded in Venezuela and how we may overcome these, following the work developed with Valeria Ortiz and Emilia Tagle. We'll look at the learning crisis in numbers. I will clarify what we mean by learning and learning recovery, and we will draw some global lessons for learning recovery and acceleration in Venezuela. So let's break the crisis down in numbers. Today, children are being left behind by exclusion and underinvestment. About 3 million children are not attending school regularly. This means that barely 60% of students are actually going to school. But investment is also alarming. In 2023, Venezuela spent barely $232 per children. This is very low compared to the average of Latin America, which is $3,000, and in OECD countries, which is $9,000. And of course, this has a great impact in learning. Today, third graders cannot read fluently. 68% of third graders show reading delays. Over 40% read 68 words per minute or fewer, which is far from the target, which is 85 words per minute. And 47% report having learned less during remote schooling. Data shows that these results are cumulative over time. In 2024, over 90% of students graduating failed to reach minimum reading comprehension levels. So this means that students who are graduating cannot read and understand a simple text. This is how severe the learning crisis is. And learning loss is also unequal. The impact of the pandemic in Latin America and the Caribbean showed that most vulnerable students were most impacted. While the richest experienced learning loss equivalent to 22% that school year, the poorest lost the equivalent of over 80% that school year. So this tells us that learning loss is not only about reduced outcomes, it's also about widening existing inequalities. So what do we mean by learning and learning recovery? Following the World Bank definition, we understand learning as a dynamic and continuous process through which a person can shape their understanding and their way of acting. This process is shaped by experiences, social interactions, and cognitive, emotional, and motivational factors. And this is important because learning loss is not just about losing content, but it is also about the environment, the relationships, and the conditions and opportunities that children need to actually develop skills over time. When we talk about recovery, we refer to regaining essential skills that students lost due to prolonged interrupted schooling and impoverished learning conditions. But this is not enough. We also need to work on acceleration, for which we mean going beyond catching students up and consolidating core learning through more effective and targeted instruction. So, what are some global lessons that we can draw for learning recovery and acceleration in Venezuela? With my peers, I follow the RAPID framework developed by the World Bank and UNICEF after the pandemic, and we focus specifically in 3 dimensions: assess, prioritize, and increase. First, we need to assess and monitor learning levels regularly. At a system level, assessments allow governments to understand the extent of the problem, identify inequalities, and, of course, develop policy decisions. And we can learn from CIMSE in Chile and RIMA in Mexico. At a classroom level, assessments allow teachers to identify where students are at, adapt their instruction, and adapt their teaching to where students are actually at. And we can learn from DIA in Chile and TeachFX, which is an AI tool used in the USA for teachers. We need to also prioritize the teaching of what matters most. By foundational learning, we mean that which has lasting value, supports future learning, and transfers across subjects. More specifically, we refer to reading, mathematics, and social-emotional skills. Key components for prioritization are alignment across curriculum, assessment, and teacher training, prioritized instruction, and school-level flexibility. We can learn from curriculum prioritization in Chile after the pandemic, and the reading program Leo, Juego y Aprendo, which increased reading comprehension by over 50% over 2 years. Lastly, we need to increase the amount of learning that's happening in the classrooms. Some effective, proven recovery strategies are targeted instruction, structured pedagogy, tutoring programs, self-guided learning, and expanded learning time. System priorities for increasing include scaling proven interventions and strengthening teacher development. And we can learn from Pratham in India, which is a targeted instruction intervention supported by the GA peer report, and from Conectando Aprendo and Mineduc in Chile, which are tutoring programs that improved student achievement by 0.29 standard deviations. Taken together, all these lessons point to a broader conclusion. Learning recovery is not a single intervention. It is a coordinated effort to make sure that students regain the skills that they have lost. So what do we need to do? We need to prioritize foundational skills. We need to diagnose national learning levels and in-class monitoring. We need to scale proven interventions, and we need to offer targeted support and effective instruction to meet students where they actually are. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, everyone. And for the panel portion of this, I'd like to invite James Kim, a professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Obviously, Veronica, who's already up there, gave a beautiful presentation. And then Bala Venkatachalam, an executive director at Pratham USA. And this panel will be moderated by Valeria, one of our students. So please join me in welcoming them with a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica, for your wonderful presentation. I'm happy to be moderating this panel. I'm going to introduce first the two panelists that I have here with me today. First, on my left-hand side, we have Bala. He's the president and COO of Pratham International, where he leads the organization efforts to scale evidence-based education programs and youth livelihood across Latin America, Africa, Middle East, North Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. In Latin America, Pratham works with governments and local partners to strengthen foundational learning and expand opportunities for underserved children. With over 25 years of experience in social impact, Bala has launched and grown initiatives in foundational learning, technology-enabled instruction, and vocational training across multiple regions. He previously served as Executive Director of Pratham USA and held roles at Innovations for Poverty Action, the Monitor Group, and KPMG. He also co-founded a mobile technology startup focused on field data solutions in low resource settings. Bala holds an MBA from INCAD and is qualified chartered accountant. So this is Bala. And our second great panelist is Jimmy Kim. He's professor of education and society at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His work focuses on literacy intervention and experimental design to improve outcomes for low-income students and struggling readers at scale. He holds a PhD in education from Harvard University. Previously, he has led large-scale policy relevance research initiatives in partnerships with school districts, and he founded the READS Lab. Research enhances adaptations designed for scale in literacy. His research centered on building students' domain knowledge and reading engagement to strengthen long-term reading comprehension, including the development and evaluation of scalable interventions such as MORE, which is the model of reading engagement. So this is okay, panelists. So for start, talking about learning recovery, based on what Veronica mentioned in her presentation, I would want to ask you, how would you both define learning recovery? And what do you think are the misconceptions that people tend to think when talking about learning recovery that is key to keep in mind now that we're talking about Venezuela? Based on your experience in crisis-affected countries, I would love to know what do you find by learning recovery? Who wants to start?
First of all, it's great to see you all here, and thanks for the wonderful privilege of serving on this panel. I actually want to zoom out a bit and tell you something that I learned from your wonderful presentation, which is when we think about learning recovery, we can't have a fixed mindset. We've got to have a growth mindset. It's not one and done. It's not one intervention. It's not one test score. It's not evaluation. I think one of the most important things you said is that learning is a dynamic and continuous process, and learning recovery is also a dynamic and continuous process because learning is cumulative. Grade 2 kids depend on what happened in grade 1. Grade 1 kids depend on what happened earlier. I would say the biggest misconception is it's so bad that we can't change things. I was born in South Korea, and I was doing a little history study. South Korea, after the Korean War, was in a very bad place. But what it focused on was universal access, making education a constitutional and political priority, focusing on basic compulsory education, and playing the long game. And so I think there's a lot of parallels between what happened in Korea after the Korean War and what's happening in Venezuela and other conflict-ridden areas.
Thank you very much. Bala, now we want to listen from you.
Yeah, thank you. It was, first of all, I learned a lot from your presentation. But, when you look at the data, it says that after 5 years of schooling, 90% of the kids are not able to do basic reading. And if you're in 6th grade, 65%. That's just travesty. But that's the reality. And for me, the analogy I would use is if you're getting somebody into an emergency room, you have to make sure that the patient is safe. And the question is, where do you start? Do you start with the curriculum, or where do you start? Because you want to make sure that person is actually alive, and then you can start addressing other points. To me, the idea that one needs to have there are many goals to address, many things to address. But to me, if the foundation, the basic reading is not in place, the rest of the curriculum is almost irrelevant, right? You're not going to actually make progress on that. So the question is, how can we actually set up simple goals that are addressable in a time-bound sort of manner? Because children are progressing. Children have been, and I think there is so much that we are dealing with in terms of trauma, being out of school, lack of teachers. So our heads are spinning as to where do we want to sort of start, right? And our experience, at least in whether it was in India, where we've done teaching at the right level, or in conflict regions, whether it's in Uganda or South Sudan or Lebanon, is often start with a simple goal, which is, and say, if I'd like children to be able to do basic reading and math at the end of a certain intervention period, how do I work? And I echo this idea that, we need almost like an abundance mindset. Is, yes, I don't have teachers, there is nutrition challenge, but what can I work with in terms of parents, community, in a way that we are able to help children move this along? So I would therefore encourage saying, yes, there is a crisis, there is a lot of challenges, but how do we work with what we have in terms of lack of teachers, other issues? But I know that children and families are really, really, how do you find the motivation for them to be able to sort of do that? And to me, that's a key question.
Thank you very much. And I will continue with you, Bala, based on what you just mentioned, your analogy with someone that is, if you have someone in crisis, that you have to maintain that person in the school, but also understanding, having this abundance mindset. And I want to connect this with teaching at the right level, the program that most people recognize Pratham for. I'm going to open the mic for you to explain a little bit about this, but it's when students are learning based on their learning level and not just on the grade they are at. Can you tell us a little bit more about teaching at the right level, this idea that you guys started many, many years ago, and how can you think this can relate to Venezuelan's context?
Sure. I'll probably take half a minute just to explain the context. So teaching at the right level really came out of, what we saw in India. I'd say in the early 90s, India started making rapid progress, at least with school enrollment. But what we realized was while children were enrolled in school, there was this invisible problem that children were not learning. And many of you may have sort of heard this nationwide citizens-led assessment, which I think is a key part, is how do people really understand the problem, what the problem is? And so we launched this thing called the Annual Status of Education Report, or ASER, which sort of inspired the World Bank to come up with, in 2018, the World Development Report on this whole learning challenge, etc. When we launched ASER, we realized that there was a massive problem. In India, 50% of children who get to grade 5 are not able to do even a basic text. And in the case of Venezuela, that number is even higher. And it's interesting, I don't know if my colleague Amanda Beatty is here, along with Lan Pritchett, I think they wrote this interesting paper on the negative consequences of overambitious curricula, which is, often, systems are thinking about curricula, but we're forgetting about foundational sort of skills. And what we focused on was, can we help people really understand what the problem is, whether it's teachers or parents? And so it starts with, therefore, a simple assessment. And the assessment is an oral assessment, one-on-one, where you actually sit with the child and say, it starts, I wish I had a piece of paper, I could have shown it, but it really starts with, can you read a sentence? If you're able to read a sentence, are you fluent? Or if you're not fluent, can we go to, letter, word, and so on and so forth? So the first step is really to understand where a child is and do a one-on-one sort of assessment. And once you're done with the assessment, and this is where sort of the simplicity or complexity, however we want to sort of frame, sort of comes into play, which is you then group the children. And in a Venezuelan context where you have children who've, whether it's a 5th grader or a 3rd grader, you're going to have many of them pretty much at the same level. They're sort of struggling. While age-wise they may be different, can we group children, because these are heterogeneous groups, can we group them by their learning level rather than their grade? So, one way to think of this is, if you think of grades as rows, grade 1, 2, 3, 4, and learning levels as column, right? Basic, letter, word, story, paragraph, and story, can we fundamentally reimagine this as organizing the children by the columns rather than by the rows, and do activities from where the children are. So if they're at a beginner level, start with activities where children are at a beginner sort of level. So assessment, grouping, and a targeted set of activities for each of the groups. And what we've seen is our experience, now we have done this over almost 25 years across contexts, is that whether it's in India, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, now in Latin America, including in conflict regions, that within about 100 hours of instructional intervention, we see anywhere between 70 to 80% of the kids actually progressing from not being able to read to be able to read. Now, of course, there are going to be some, and for those who have not made that progress, it's important. So assessment, group, targeted set of activities, and then you repeat that sort of process again, so the children are able to sort of make progress in time. Often, one of the things that I would say is this is a fairly cost-effective, I won't use a low-cost model, but a cost-effective model. So in India, for example, when we work with public systems, the cost per child, and I was looking at some of the numbers for Venezuela, forget OECD and stuff, it's $5 per child. So the question is, for the price of a Starbucks coffee, do we actually think it's worthwhile, doing an intervention where we know simple process, low-cost materials, can we actually help children sort of learn? And our experience shows that it is. So, and we've tried this in different sort of contexts, including in crisis context. Now, the one piece which we think is critical in addition to literacy and numeracy, I think there's a socio-emotional aspect of it. And that's not something, I can say that we've been the best at, and so there we might need to engage others, because it's not just about literacy and numeracy, because children are bringing all other kinds of challenges into the classroom, trauma and other aspects of it. And there, for example, in Honduras, we worked with this organization called Glasswing, which does interesting work, and they have a program called Sanamente, where they actually work with children who have trauma and how do you support them. So all this is to say literacy and numeracy is important, but this idea that you got to work on other aspects is actually critical. So on teaching at the right level, so clear goals, assessment, group, measure, and make sure you're actually supporting the teachers with a set of simple instructional activities and you're not overburdening them. Because my understanding is there's a massive shortage of teachers. So, and this program works either inside school or in communities. And there's evidence to show that, over 20 years after almost 9 RCTs, that we've seen this intervention work across context. So I'd strongly encourage that we should probably be looking at this.
Thank you very much, Bala. I can recall this part that you were mentioning about how important it is to do assessment in a way that is quick, simple, and that can be done by any teacher that is in the classroom. And this is a question for you, James. What have you learned from your research in the READS and also by assessing this intervention, the MORE program? How do we make assessment quickly, simple, but how do we make that it does not turn assessment into a barrier or bureaucratic process?
That's a great question, because when I do research, nobody says, great, we get to take tests across the board. We need those assessments. We need to know things are working. But I'll tell you a story. When COVID-19 happened, I was midway through a 3-year randomized controlled trial, and the school was shut down. And so we had to move to digital assessments. And one thing that we learned, 2 things, and I'll share those lessons. One is kids love assessments if they're fun. And so we didn't call them assessments. We called them a transfer challenge. How can you take what you've learned with your teachers and transfer that knowledge, move it around to this challenge? And when I met with my team and we were going through this pandemic and things were just really tough, I said, here's the purpose of the assessment. It is to get kids to laugh and love playing with language. So we had a lot of jokes and idioms and dumb dad jokes that I came up with. But in all seriousness, we know that children's listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension until about grade 8. Kids can learn a lot more complex stuff listening than they can reading. So we had a lot of just fun games and idioms and puns and jokes. And these are things that struggling readers really struggle with. So one is to really think of assessment as a fun activity where kids can really play with language. The second thing that we learned is teachers love assessments if they're useful. So, I was talking to Patrick and Eric today. If I go, hey, your kids gained about 0.25 standard deviations over this year, they'll look at me and go, totally useless, Jimmy, because it's too global. It doesn't tell them anything about their kids. And so what we started doing is we started going down to the item level. And we said, this is how your kids do on a near transfer task. We taught about the human body And they can read a passage about what happens to monkeys when they have heart attacks. And here's a far transfer passage. They can read a passage about how the anatomy of a skyscraper is like the human body. A skyscraper has a brain to control the building. It has steel, which is like a skeletal system. Teachers were really into that because they could see how far kids could transfer knowledge. So I think when I think of the bureaucracy you face, the barriers to assessment, try to make the assessment fun for kids, really reframe it, and make it really useful for teacher by drilling down to the item level and telling them how much transfer is actually occurring. I loved your point about how we have to prioritize the fundamentals, and that means seeing how far reading comprehension transfers. I think that's exactly right.
Thank you, James. I relate a lot. I am a teacher, and I understand when you tell the kids that we're doing a challenge, they're all interested in doing it. If you're doing an evaluation, well, you lost them all. So for the next question, I would love to ask you both, what do you recommend as the 3 non-negotiables for learning recovery in Venezuela now? Bala mentioned some, but if you were to decide now, what are the 3 non-negotiables for Venezuela in terms of learning recovery?
Do you want me to start? Okay, I'll say a couple of quick things, and they all have the word access in it. One non-negotiable is just access into school. Just the fundamental goal of getting kids into school. The attendance rates you showed were really alarming, but also present an opportunity. The second is access to grade level texts. I agree with a lot of what Bala said. Look, we have to teach at the right level, but we need kids to be able to access grade level texts. When kids take PISA, there's no personalization in PISA. There's a grade level test for 15-year-olds. And the third is access to democracy in our economy. Why are we doing this? Because we want kids to have an education that enables them to access democratic life and the economy that they're in. We want them to vote, to participate in our democracy, and to advance the economy that is so critical to the flourishing of the nation. I just want to end with one quick thought. Some of you may know the book Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and Joseph Robinson. It's a very simple message. I'll go back to Korea. South Korea, North Korea, same people, same language, same history, same culture. Completely different lives. Why? Man-made political and economic institutions. We can hope for a much better future if we change the institutions that we're all thinking about right now.
It's interesting. Daron's work is fascinating, I agree. So 3 non-negotiables. Like I mentioned earlier, I actually think we need to have simple goals. There are many things we can address. If foundational learning is a priority, then that ought to be a goal and a time-bound goal that, both the system, but you can't just expect the system because it's very fragmented. The system is extremely fragmented. So how do you get multiple actors to actually focus on a simple goal, which is by a certain timeline, children are able to do basic reading and math. We'll get to the grade level. I agree that should be the floor at least, right? But at least the first step is to make sure that they get to the foundational literacy and numeracy sort of levels. So one is, can we agree on that simple goals and then make sure we understand what the current situation is? I think assessing where it is. The second is, I would sort of say, work with who you have, whether it's teachers, parents, community, because time is going by. If you wait for teachers to be recruited, etc., kids are not just waiting, they're getting older, and the 6th graders, the next time we realize it'll be like they'll be 8th graders and they're still sort of struggling. So work with what we have, and I do think that coordination across agencies, there are multiple sort of agencies working in Venezuela now, in addition to the public system. How do we stay coordinated? Because to me, that's one of the challenges. All of them are working, and rightfully in sort of different directions, but we can align on a simple goal and stay coordinated. I think it'll go a long way in at least getting to this sort of point that we are. And I think then make it visible and simple for parents, for teachers, that things are actually progressing. Because, once they see that things are changing, I think it motivates them. Otherwise, it's like a hopeless, desperate sort of situation. I do think that we need to, and I think whatever method we use, they need to see progress, they need to see some quick wins, but often start with something simple and achievable. Because, if you're trying to reform, yes, take a long arc of view, and I think that's important, because I think these things take time, but often start with simple, measurable, and achievable goals so that we see that progress is sort of happening. Otherwise, the system and everybody is going to get really sort of demotivated by the daunting challenge that we sort of have. So.
Thank you very much. I'm going to repeat what Bala just mentioned. So it's simple goals that are visible and through a coordination between all the different stakeholders that are around a student's learning journey. And now I would love to open questions for the public. So we're going to grab one question. Okay, 3 questions. We listen them to the 3 of them, and then I'll give you the space for all 3 to answer. Is that okay? Perfect. So let's start for one question. I saw your hand. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys have brought really good points. My name is Francisco Miriteran. I'm a student at Columbia. I see the big theme in this conference and this next stage for Venezuela is trust and reestablishing trust. Establishing trust to get investment, trust to encourage teachers to pursue the career and to stay in the career. And so when I think of learning recovery and I'm seeing the numbers that there's 3 million students that are outside of the classroom, my main concern is how do we reestablish trust in the student that this is what they should do. I think education in Venezuela is not competing with, further skills and job opportunities. I think it's competing with survival. And so at what point will the education in Venezuela and how long can we get there before students themselves will want to be in the classroom as opposed to having to deal with the other day. We're North Korea right now and we want to be South Korea. And so the daily problems of the kid go beyond that, and I think it's important we address that. I don't know, I guess.
Thank you very much. So first question. Second question over here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the panel and for the wonderful presentation. So it's an odd place to be standing because the whole audience is behind me. But I wanted to ask, the previous panel talked a lot about the implementation and the sequencing of the reforms, more with regards to the teaching profession. And for me, that is key because we do know the international evidence, we know the best practices, we know the high returns of investing in foundational learning. But the problem is how to go about implementation in the field, especially in this context of emergency and of limited resources. So I wanted to ask you, how do you suggest we go about implementing a program similar to Teaching at the Right Level or other remedial education programs? Should we start with a pilot and in a more like controlled and pure, implementation of the methodology, or start with the most vulnerable populations, or should we embed the principles of the methodology in the curriculum and in the teaching, the groupings, for example, the constant assessments? That would be, I think, very good guidance from you of how to go about implementing this type of methodology.
Thank you very much. And one more question. I see your hand raised over there. Thanks. Sarita, over there. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for your words. My name is Zinedine Partipilo. I'm a research fellow at the economics department. And I am curious about standards. The standards of recovery, the standards of assessment, and the standard of education. So for obvious reason, due to the crisis, we've lowered our standards. And I'm wondering if the new standard is going to become a close enough is good enough, or if the new standard will be only the best is good enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we had 3 questions. The first one, how do we reestablish trust? The second one, how do we go on with implementation? Where do we start? And the third one, like, what are the standards right now? So I open the mic. Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start with the easy question of how you build trust. You know, on a very basic human level, like how do you build trust between people? You say you're going to do something, you do it, and you do it well. Simple. That's how you build trust. But let me zoom out a bit. One of the most important books that I think is underappreciated, studies that's underappreciated in the U.S. context that has to do, I'll get to the trust issue really fast, is Tony Bright's book, Catholic Schools and the Common Good. And the reason why this study is important is it's based on a nationally represented sample, high school and beyond, they're public schools, Catholic schools, but the important finding that they have is that Catholic schools reduce socioeconomic inequities over time, right? So the SCS slope becomes shallow, right? It's not positive. Why does that happen? Well, he lists a lot of things, but Catholic schools, they build a lot of trust between the children and the families, the children and the teachers and the teachers. He calls it an inspirational ideology. Obviously, that's the Catholic faith that leads to this positive view of human flourishing. And so I would say one thing we need to do when we think about rebuilding trust is like get rid of the public-private distinction and just ask, like, how do good schools build trust? And if you have to look at religious schools and Catholic schools, go look there. But don't think about the public-private dichotomy. Think about where are the places that build trust and apply those lessons. And I think that's one place you could start.
Thank you, James. Bala or Veronica?
Yeah. You want to go?
I also wanted the easy question, but the professor already took it. But I did want to touch on a part of that question on trust, which was on getting children to school, which we didn't focus as much because we have an area that specifically addresses that. And I just wanted to say that it's like a multifaceted effort, right? Like there are many components. We also the problem has so many layers socially that we also need to provide food in schools, for instance, like children, because you were asking how do we get them to school. So I think you're going to hear more about it in the well-being panel later on. I would encourage you to stay. But yeah, I just wanted to say that I was focusing in my presentation on foundational learning and what has to do more with this area, but that it's more complex than that. And you have the right to point to that.
To your question, where do we start? How does the implementation work? And I think it's a fair question. And maybe, Veronica, you should sort of talk about some of the conversations we've been with some of the students here. I think, you know, there's not a perfect place to start. Of course, you got to pilot. You got to actually, because every context is different. But it's important to sort of commit. So even as we speak, I know that we've been in conversations, Fea Alegria, and one of the family foundations to possibly support a pilot is, if we were to do this in Venezuela in 4 months from now, what does it look like? What will the materials look like? Who do we work with, etc. So that even if we were to work with, say, 500 or 1,000 children, we learn by doing things. I think it's important to actually start doing things and not wait for the perfect, if we were to wait for, teacher training to be sorted, sequencing, whether it's in-service, pre-service, children are just going to get, time's just going to go by. I do think that start with either, it could be in school or out of school, it doesn't matter. In this case, obviously, it is a set of schools where they have community schools that we're working with. That's one set of pilot that we're working with. Separately, we are also working with the NRC, from an education and emergency sort of context to see, can we train some of them? Because the idea is, can we, it's interesting that you sort of meant, how do we get maybe 1,000 or 10,000 leaders of practice? They could be teachers, they could be community volunteers who can take a simple methodology and actually work with children. And it can start with 500 to 1,000 children, but can we make the start? Can we learn? Can we develop the materials, which could then be some kind of a template, so that over the next 12 to maybe 24 months, we set more ambitious sort of numbers. I mean, the numbers that we're talking about are 3 million, but let me tell you, in India's largest state, we have 250 million children, right? Which is sort of the size that of, school-going population or more, or, way greater than the United States. So it's possible. UP has moved the needle, but it takes time. It takes, obviously, committed people. But if you wait for the right set of sequencing, I think it's going to be hard. Start with a pilot or two in different sort of contexts. And I go back to the point that I think agencies need to be integrated. Otherwise, I think we'll be running in different directions. They can have their own ways of doing. But I do think, if we set ourselves by end of 2027, can we create at least 1,000 leaders of practice in Venezuela who know this method, who then can work with maybe 10 or 20 instructors or teachers, and that's how you're going to, because if it's a big problem. I think you got to break it down into smaller chunks and need to get started. Otherwise, this ain't happen. And I think to the question of standards, I agree that given where we are, clearly PISA is like light years away if you ask me, but that's where we want to get to. But I do think it's sort of a step function. I think that's why we shouldn't lose sight of it. But at least at the first step, children should be able to even read a basic text, in Spanish and do basic arithmetic. And my worry is that children even sixth graders are struggling with that. How do you even get to that? And then we can get about aligning with curriculum and standards and all of that. I think let's sort of get to solve the challenge, and this is not an overnight problem. This has been happening over a period of time. So you got to work with teachers who are dealing all kinds of challenges. So this is not, again, I think that's an aspirational thing, but at least let's something which is we can get to, so that we can work towards it. And this ain't happen overnight. And this is not to me, this is the basic minimum, but not the standard. So it's the floor, definitely not the ceiling, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for the three. Thank you very much for your questions. So based on what you both share here in the panel and what Veronica presented, is understanding who are the stakeholders around, what has been working, how do we build trust, but start doing things right now. Don't wait for the best plan to be developed or designed. It's better to start now. The kids are needing all the efforts. So please join me in a round of applause. Thank you very much. We'll take a picture. So we're going to take a picture, then we're going to hand out some gifts, and please, everyone stay seated.
Okay. Ready? I'm going to take a couple. 1, 2, 3. Thank you so much.